Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the great work that my colleague, Senator Durbin, and Senator Schumer, Senator Rubio, and others have done on the immigration bill, and I'm going to be pleased this week to support their work. But I come to the floor today, as I have most weeks since being sworn in, to talk about the issue that has dominated discussions in my state over the past 6 months, and that's the issue of gun violence. We commemorated last week the 6-month anniversary of the deadly shooting in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, in which 26 and 7-year-olds, first graders, were gunned down, and 6 of their teachers, including as well the gunman and his mother. And a lot of the families came down here last week to continue to lobby both the House and the Senate. And the look on their face is a complicated look. It's clearly, first and foremost, a look of just incalculable grief as these families still try to figure out how to live the first summer of their life without their loved one, whether it be a first grader who would have been heading into second grade, or a mother or a teacher or a brother or sister. But there is also, in combination with this grief, this look of shock. This look of shock that frankly gets worse every time they come down here as they try to understand how this place could stand by and do nothing, absolutely nothing, in the wake of the horror that Newtown, Connecticut has seen. Now, at least we've taken a vote here on the Senate floor. And very much like the description that Senator Durbin gave earlier of his attempt several years ago to pass the DREAM Act, we got 54 votes on the floor of the Senate. And under our draconian and backwards rules, that wasn't enough to get the bill done. But the House hasn't even scheduled a debate on gun violence legislation. Families in Newtown, Connecticut just cannot understand that. They can't understand how senators and House members can look them in the eye, can hear the story of their grief, and do nothing. They certainly can't understand it after almost to the day of the 6-month anniversary, another mass shooting occurred, this time on the other side of the country. And you almost know the story before you hear it. Mass shooting, 4 dead, others wounded. In Newtown, we didn't even have to pick up the paper to know that it was going to be an assault weapon. It was going to be high-capacity magazines, once again. Now, every story is a little bit different, so this one was an assault weapon that was partially handmade. This time it was a lot of ammunition that may not have been used, but it's just a story that gets repeated over and over and over again. Lots of people dead, assault weapon used, high-capacity magazines. And so for those people who say we can't do anything about it, well, we can. We can, because we can keep these dangerous military-style weapons in the hands of law enforcement and people who are hired and trained to shoot these weapons for a living. We can say that 8, 10, 15 rounds is enough, that you don't need 30 rounds in a magazine. You don't need 100 rounds. We can do something about our mental health system to try to reach out and give some help to people who are struggling. But we don't. And that's what's so hard for the families of Newtown to understand. What's additionally hard for them to understand is this number. Since those 28 people were killed in Newtown on December 14th, Mr. President, 5,033 people have died at the hands of gun violence across this country. Now, this chart's a couple days old, so you can probably take down the 33 and add a handful more. And I hope people here have gotten to understand the stories of people like Jack Pinto and Dylan Hockley and Grace McDonald. I hope that people here have come to know the stories of the 20 little boys and girls who we will never know their greatness because they were cut down in their youth. But I want to tell you some other stories about the common, everyday, almost routine gun violence that for some reason we have just decided to live with in this country. And so I'm coming down here every week just to tell you another handful of stories about victims. And today, instead of telling detailed stories about specific victims, I just want to tell you about one weekend in New York City. About 2 weeks ago, the weekend of May 31st to June 2nd was kind of the first truly warm outdoor weekend that we had in the Northeast. And the police in places like New York City and Bridgeport and Hartford, they've come to dread that first real hot summer weekend because the summers tend to come with a lot of guns and a lot of gun violence and a lot of shootings in places that maybe not a lot of Americans are used to, living in the safety and security of their neighborhoods. But let me tell you what happened on that one weekend in one city of New York, New York. That weekend, 25 people were shot over the course of 48 hours. 6 people were killed over one single weekend in New York City. It started with Ivan Martinez, 21 years old, who was approached at about 3:25 a.m. on Friday night by a 20-year-old gunman and a woman in the Bronx. The gunman shot Martinez once in the head, and then he ran off with the woman. Over the course of the weekend, 12 people were shot in Brooklyn, 8 people were shot in the Bronx, 4 in Queens. It went like this on Sunday night. At 12:10 a.m., a 21-year-old man was shot in the leg. At 2:36 a.m., a 21-year-old man was shot 3 times on East New York Ave in Brooklyn. About an hour later, at 3:30, a 20-year-old man was shot in the leg at Bedford Park in the Bronx. 4:12 a.m. that morning, a 35-year-old man brought himself to Jamaica Hospital with a gunshot wound. At 11:40 a.m., a 15-year-old was shot in the leg and the back. 11:40 a.m., middle of the day on Sunday, a 15-year-old shot in the leg and the back. And then about 3:25, a gunman opened fire at the corner of Bedford and Lenox at Prospect Lefferts Gardens. The carnage in one weekend barely made news across this country. Most people wouldn't know it if I didn't come down to the Senate floor and tell this story. That is what we have come to accept in this country. This represents a dramatic drop in gun violence in New York City. So far, we've had 440 shootings in New York City. That's a 23% reduction from last year. This has been a good year in New York City, and 440 people have been shot, and we do nothing about it here. We can't even bring ourselves to say that criminals shouldn't have guns, that gun trafficking done out of the back of vans on the side streets of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens should be a crime. We can't even do that on the floor of the Senate. That weekend, maybe the most tragic shooting was one that didn't end up in a death. And that was the shooting of a little girl named Tayloni Marchik. 3 men opened fire in a wild episode that weekend in Brooklyn. People said that it sounded like it was the 4th of July. So many gunshots were going off in this neighborhood. It was likely gang activity, but the consequence of the shooting wasn't a gang member. It was a little 11-year-old girl who was struck through her neck. The bullet lodged in her spine, and though Tayloni lived, she will never walk again. Listen, I grieve every single morning and every single night for the 20 little girls and boys who died in Newtown, Connecticut. And if that's what's prompted us to finally have a serious discussion here on the floor of the Senate and the House about gun violence reform, then so be it. But this is just an average summer weekend in New York. Little girls getting paralyzed, shootings throughout Saturday and Sunday night, people getting shot in the middle of broad daylight on a Sunday afternoon, and we can do something about it. We don't have the power to eliminate gun violence. We can't make bad people stop doing bad things. But we can pass common sense laws like background checks to check if criminals are getting guns or people with serious, dangerous mental illness. We can increase the resources of social workers and psychologists to try to reach some of these kids, to teach them other ways of dealing with their anger than just going and reaching for a gun. We can lock up anybody who takes a bunch of guns from a gun show, throws them into a sack, and goes and sells them to criminals on the streets of New York or Bridgeport or Los Angeles or Chicago. We are not helpless. We have power in this place to do something about the mass shootings in Newtown, the mass shootings in Santa Monica, and the 5,033 people who have died across this country since December 14th in the 6 months since. It's not too late, Mr. President. We have a chance to come back to this floor after immigration, perhaps after the summer. Let cooler heads prevail and allow this body to do something about the scourge of gun violence that so far this place has had no answer for and causes the families of Newtown and the families of these victims to leave this place shaking their heads.